Where's my glass? Mimosas. Okay. So our original plan was that Ben and I would do this combined keynote for you in the morning. And then it looked like Ben wasn't going to be here. So that was odd for me. And then it turns out he is here. So here's what we're going to do this morning. I have outtakes from my keynote. There are things that I wrote and things that I was thinking about that didn't quite fit in by the time I was organizing it for yesterday morning. And so I have learned to save everything. I have outtake folders, outtake exam questions, outtake sermon topics, things like that. So I brought my outtakes with me. And Ben has a couple of narratives that are going to interweave with this. So we're just going to have a good time. And thank you for turning on the lights. There's a little bit more energy now flowing through the room. So here's where we're going to start. I had a piece in, can everybody hear if I'm both shouting and sitting here at the microphone? Is the microphone on?
You just need the whole button.
All right. So I have this piece that I was going to call Remnant Talk. And you know, I was using the Isaiah passage and spent the time working with the imagery of the streams and the deserts and things like that. But there's a whole other take, at least one of the other 10,000 takes that you can get on this particular scripture. And that is looking at the original prophecy in terms of its original audience. And Isaiah's original audience for this passage were the exiles in Babylon. And they had been there a generation or so, and they were pretty sure that they weren't ever going to get home. No one was ever going to get out of Babylon. They were just going to have to stay there forever until Persia comes along and takes over the Babylonian Empire. And Cyrus has a whole different take on how to keep people from rebelling under their masters. And that is to send people back. The last two empires before this, Assyria and Babylon, had used this relocation effort. When they would conquer a land, they would take huge amounts of the population and go resettle them someplace completely out, where the cultures were different, the religions were different, the foods were different, you know, everything was different. And there were very few of any leadership quality or that kind of infrastructure, human resource infrastructure left in the lands and, of the original inhabitants. And then they would also pick up some other people that they conquered and move in to fill the void. So Cyrus comes at this from an entirely different perspective and gets the idea that maybe if he sends the people back home with the command to rebuild, this will help solidify his empire. And that's what he does. But the exiles in Babylon don't realize that that's about to happen yet. So they're still kind of hunkered down, and it's that caravan of despair that we were singing about. So here's the Isaiah passage when he's talking about all of this thing, all these, God's going to do these great things. You're going to see the Lord's majesty right in front of you, and the blind are going to see, and the deaf are going to hear, and we're going to have all those fun little jumping deer again enjoy, and there's going to be a highway made, and you're going to walk it, and you go back to Zion, go back to your holy city. So I was playing around with this remnant piece, and two ideas came to mind. One is about the true substance of remnants if we think about fabric. And I was thinking, too, that evidently Isaiah and Jeremiah didn't hang out with anybody who worked with cloth. We had great pottery and potter images and refiner's fire and things like that, but we don't really see anything about weaving in those images. But if they had gone to the weaver's shop or the clothesmaker's shop, this is an image that I think they could really have worked on. And it would have been the idea that, you know, remnants, well, let me go with the idea of the image of the cloth first, in God's hands. So if you would imagine fine wool or silk or linen threads on a loom, weaving, unraveling, unfinished cloth, left with raw edges and hanging threads. That would be the Israelites in exile, kind of on the loom, but unfinished, and you've got these dangling pieces just from where everything was torn apart. Imagine God taking up the shuttlecock, weaving the abandoned piece into a new whole cloth, an almost wholly different cloth, a holy cloth with new purpose and new possibilities. Or imagine a cloth remnant, an actual piece of cloth, a remnant in God's hands, sewn into place with other pieces, different kinds of pieces, some remnants and some cut just for this particular purpose, trimmed and pinned and basted together, and then stitch by stitch made whole. A patchwork, maybe quilted, maybe not, but a patchwork, a holy whole, tied together once again with new purpose and new possibilities. So that was that one image I played with in terms of being a remnant, because biblical references to the remnant coming back home. But then I always have this like cynical side, the dark side of what I'm thinking about. And so then I thought about, well, how about if we took it from the other perspective, and if we're thinking about ourselves as, well, all we are is a remnant. Okay, so kind of get into that headset here. And as a remnant, I had to pull my imagery up here because I worked really hard on it and I want to look at it again. All right, so sometimes we consider, let's think of ourselves as if we're only thinking about a remnant, like a piece of cloth, this odd-shaped or smaller piece of cloth, separated from the bolt, left by our lonesomes on a table, not just pushed to the back of the store, but dragged out on the sidewalk by them, whoever them is, and left to fend for ourselves. And then, what kind of talk does that image of being a remnant generate? Not real good talk. So I called this remnant talk, and that it comes from the belief that it is just us, and the just us may be the congregation as a whole, or a conference, or a group within a congregation. You know, we have these just us's around. And and so here's how you would know if you were hearing remnant talk. Remnant talk is self-focusing, blame-laying, diversity negating, hope limiting, and scarcity believing. I have more. Not much more, but I have more. Remnant talk is delaying action, denying possibilities, de-energizing, demoralizing, and debilitating. Okay, so if you got that floating around in the congregation, there's some remnant talk going on. But the reminder is that there is a truth. When this is happening, we've usually forgotten one of those vital biblical truths, and that a great truth of our faith, and that is to be a prophetic remnant, to be the smaller part of a once larger whole, to be a smaller congregation than a once larger one, to be a smaller conference, a smaller denomination than a once larger one, is to have to lean into the quality God sees in you for God's purpose.
So outside of Owensboro, Kentucky, there is this impressive, majestic monastery that once served as the mother house for a thriving international order of Ursuline nuns that stretched all the way from New England to Northeast Ohio, Pennsylvania, down through Kentucky, and through New Mexico into Central America. And Ursuline nuns would go all around the world, and they would come back to this place, Mount St. Joseph, to spend their final days. It's an impressive place that you would never find unless you had been intentional to go out looking for it. Because to find it, it's at the dead end of a county road along a river's edge that doesn't have a bridge to get to the other side of the river. And rising out of soybean fields are just all of these huge buildings and a huge church and all of these residential things and a all-girls school that used to provide a boarding school education for Catholic girls around that region. When I was young, I attended a 2-week music camp at Mount St. Joseph, Maple Mount as it was called. And I used to just kind of marvel at these nuns up in the naves in the chapel that they would wheel in wheelchairs. And I was just, you know, Protestant enough that all of that stuff just kind of gave me the kicks. So I went there several different times as a kid, and when I returned back to Kentucky as a UCC pastor, I used to make retreats at Mount St. Joseph. And one of the women that I remember from my music camp days was Sister Margaret. She was the youngest and the spryest nun around Mount St. Joseph. She was probably youngest, meaning she was probably in her 50s at the time. And when I returned as now a pastor on retreat, I remember one evening walking around, was out walking and thinking and praying, and saw Sister Margaret, and she was wearing tennis shoes and shorts, now in her late 60s, and I'm really just Protestant enough to get a kick out of a nun in shorts and tennis shoes. And so I caught up with Sister Margaret and reintroduced myself, and we walked and we talked around that impressive, huge campus. And she would point out buildings, residence halls that had once served as the place where these girls had been students at the boarding school, or now all boarded up. And she would walk past facilities like the indoor swimming pool and the gymnasium, now with chains on the doors and hadn't been used for several years. The only place we walked where I spotted any sort of new activity was in the graveyard, where it seemed like the number of newer, cleaner headstones was catching up with the number of older, moss-covered ones. And I said to Sister Margaret, I don't know if this was rude or not, but I said to her, what is going to happen here? I mean, this place obviously just reeks of the old past, the old glory days, but what's going on right now is just not sustainable. The average age of the nuns there at best was in their late 80s, and they weren't bringing in any newer, younger people like Sister Margaret to help make things go. And she said to me one of those things that someone says to you, and you probably have about 5 or 10 of these things, but I have about 5 or 10 things in my head that just refuse to let me go. She said to me, if and when we ever need to, we will sell all of this and we will move into an apartment. We'll move into an apartment. And I thought, an apartment? Looking at all, I could just see the vans pulling up, wheeling all of these old nuns off of this Mount St. Joseph into some apartment complex somewhere. I could just see, you know, how could you leave this impressive place that had been there, a monastery that had been there for 150 years? And the next piece is, she said, because we don't need all of this to fulfill our mission. That's the part that really stuck with me. We don't need all this to fulfill our mission. So what she was talking about was that remnant community that she was going to move to the apartment. But what I could hear in Sister Margaret's voice was not a resignation to sorrow or dread or woe is us, but an energy and almost a hopefulness, sadness of course, but a hopefulness beyond this present moment that God still has a mission for us, a mission that is to be fulfilled. And God will give us the tools, and we will adjust to our surroundings in order to fulfill that mission. And that's the beauty of a remnant community. It is that it has not lost its way. It is still so committed and devoted to its ultimate mission that it doesn't let the change in the midst of those circumstances deter it from fulfilling that mission. So what is it that you need in order to fulfill your mission? What can you let go of in order to fulfill your mission? And what is it that God is still giving to you and that you are praying for that mission to be fulfilled?
We're going to give you a chance to think about that for a few moments and do a little bit of writing and a little bit of sharing around your table.